à tous, bienvenue.
Hello everyone, welcome to Convergence for the 2022 edition. My name is Clément Fournier. I work for UMatter, editor-in-chief, and as partner of Convergence, I am facilitating this session on funding sustainable transition. Today I'm welcoming three speakers. Start with you. Grégoire, can you introduce yourself? Hello everyone, Grégoire Chauvière-Le Drian. I work at the European Investment Bank. What is it? It's the European Union Bank, a public bank, the largest public bank in the world, one of the greatest accomplishments of the European Union. And since it was created in 1957 and funds public priority investments in Europe for more than 3 years now, the bank has quite a strong ambition. We'll talk about this today, which is to become the European Bank of Climate, so facilitating the environmental transition, which we care much for, and that has become an urgency since February of this year. I'll give the floor to the next speaker. Claire Tutenuy, I'm General Delegate of the EPE, Companies for the Environment, more than 60 global companies from different industries working together to integrate the environment further and to make it part of their strategy and to make this transition their raison d'être. We created a program called Zero Emissions by 2050. Those companies have made commitments to reduce emissions as part of their activities, but also for their customers and suppliers. So we published best practices, methods. We've been part of working groups working on funding. The largest banks are part of EPE, and of course, funding is part of our reflections. Christian Nicole, I work in a bank, and I am also part of the Rousseau Institute to do studies on this transition, the economy and financing. This year we've published a study trying to understand the cost for France to accomplish this transition. Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. Now we know who you are, where you come from. Today, we want to ask the question of how to fund environmental transition, sustainable mobility, energy transition, sobriety policies, agriculture. That's a lot of money that will be required for this transition in the coming years. We've been talking about this transition in a long time. IPCC was created in 1988. This type of organization have been saying this for quite a long time, saying that we must invest in the transition, but unfortunately, investments is still slow in this industry. That's thousands of billions of dollars that must be invested at global level for this transition. We need to find this money somewhere, but it's the end of abundance these days, so we'll see if that applies to funding as well. And during this an hour and a half, we'll have discussions. For the first hour, we'll have debates, listen to the speakers, and we will allocate some time at the end of the conference so you can ask your questions. Don't hesitate to write down your questions, and we will listen to them at the end of the session. So thank you for thinking about those questions during the debate to feed our debates at the end. And the first thing I'd like to ask all of you is the following. We talk about funding, investing thousands of billions, but as citizens or professionals, we don't really have a clear view of the needs, where we'll need to invest, what's the priority, what's most efficient. Is it better to invest in wind energy, turbines, other industries? So I'd like to hear how you feel about the investment needs for the environmental transition. I'll give the floor to Christian. I know that the Rousseau Institute published a report, 2% for 2 degrees. Could you tell us the trends that you're seeing? Yes, thank you. So for a year, we've been trying to count how much it would cost for France to accomplish carbon neutrality. We committed to respecting the Paris Agreement, so we should at least invest that much. So we made a minimum calculation. So largest emissions come from transportation, industry, agriculture, construction, and waste. We've added 2 industries, one which will be very important, carbon sinks, forests, etc., that can absorb the additional emissions that we will have in 2050. Second industry, which is a cross-functional industry, in order to coordinate transition, and this requires a lot of cash. So how much is that? After our calculation, based on 33 levers to decarbonize, moving to clean cars, clean trucks, transition in the air traffic, innovation in construction for residences, and the rest of the industry. So that we applied that for all industries, which leads to a 182 billion investment per year. Out of this amount, more than 2/3 are already being spent. We're already spending a lot of several billions to buy cars. So we are already investing. Same for constructions, renovation projects. So we must move those projects to a decarbonized system. And the additional investment is 57 billion euros per year up until 2050. Out of those 57 billions, we thought that the state should invest about 36 billions. Okay, that gives us an idea. What is the GDP in France? 2,500 billions. So a little more than 2% of GDP every year. 2.3. I thought you might want to react. Do you agree with Christian? Yes, that's more or less the same scale. What really matters is this additional investment. This might sound like a lot, but it's not that much in the end. And one very French specificity, which we should be aware of, is that in the out of those 5 levers for decarbonization, we talked about industry, construction, agriculture, transportation. Most countries, especially European countries, don't have the same concerns or priorities than France. France has already decarbonized its energy. We can put wind turbines, but that would replace nuclear energy. So our energy is already very much decarbonized. When it comes to the industry, the emissions are quite modest, 70 million tons compared to almost out of 500. So that's not so much when it comes to saving on emissions. And the rest is transportation, construction, housing for the most part, and agriculture and food. And in those 3 industries, France is one of the few countries that set those priorities. Energy, industry in Germany are, for example, the main topic, especially to produce electricity. In other countries, it's industry, but in France, it's those other industries. That's why we're focusing on the transition from households, from individuals, and how to fund it, because these are changes. For quite a few years, an electrical car will be more expensive than a thermal one. So how can households participate actively? Grégoire, do you have any ideas, insights on the scale of investment needs? We probably share 2 observations, and we see that in the European Bank. There are some very high investment needs, and as it was said, the more time we take, the higher the investments will be. So we need to accelerate, and make proposals when it comes to investments. Another aspect is important. Public fundings won't be enough. The needs are such that this transition must be a convergence between public fundings but also private fundings. That means companies but also individuals in order to facilitate that transition. So at European level, since we're viewing things from a European scale, not just French, it is true that France is very specific when it comes to its energy mix compared to other European countries. At European level, we really wanted to make sure that we could incentivize the public sector in supporting this transformation. Unfortunately, the geopolitical context is proving us right. This ambition that we had in the COP21 in Paris, renewed in 2019 during the European elections, which pushed the European Bank to become a European climate bank with its state members through a commitment to double those fundings in favor of the environmental transition by 2050. The figures might be a bit much to take, but we used to be around 15 billion euros of investment per year for so-called positive climate impact projects. We have committed to doubling this ambition up to 30 billion euros per year. And since the EIB does not work alone, but in partnership with private sector, we have a ratio of 1 to 3. For €1 invested by the European Bank, we mobilize 2 more euros. So 30 billions of investments per year accounts for about 100 billion euros per year for projects that have a positive impact on the climate. On a decade, we would reach this magical number of 1,000 billion euros investment. It might seem like a lot, but it's a baseline. And that's a scale that we have identified for the next decade in order to reach that objective, which is Fit for 55, reducing by 50% the emissions by 2030. You were ready to react, yes? Yes, just to give you some more information so that you understand why it's important to go through that transition. These are hundreds or thousands of billions, but let's not forget that the transition to carbon neutrality has strong benefits. You probably heard of it in the past few months. The commercial balance is in deficit. Europe pays thousands of billions of euros to pay for its coal, gas, and others. So in that case, should we invest, the balance would be plus 60 up to 80 billions every year. So that's what we're losing every year. That's for France and Europe. But there's other benefits. Most studies on this topic show that there will be 300 to 900,000 jobs created as part of the transition, reducing unemployment, saving billions. We know the cost relating to health, but we can estimate those savings around 2 to 3 billion. So we could save 8 to 10 billion euros per year thanks to this transition. So transitioning will bring money as well. At the start of the year, we estimated that this would account to 150 euros gain for households doing insulation in their house and moving to an electric car. So it's not just a cost, it can also bring money, and the earlier the better. I hear you talking about dozens or hundreds of billions, but with that amount, what can you fund? We're talking about money. This is a bit vague. It's not very specific, but what can you fund in order to transition with this money? Having every French person buying an electric car, is that sustainable? Is the point to build wind turbines? Is that really sustainable? So what's the project of society that we're funding here? And what are the possible actions? I know that in EPE you talked about energy insulation, for example. So what would it bring? How would it happen? Yes, it's a very difficult project. We talk about it a lot. It's one of the three main projects because most houses are owned by individuals. When it comes to the business case, there are benefits, but they're not equitably disseminated, and these people don't make decisions only based on the economy. There are other benefits to insulate, comfort, less noise, etc. But it's not really easy to include in a business case, so we're facing many issues on that project. First, professional competency. We need to train people, companies to be performant when it comes to insulation, because when you just change a window but don't change the walls or the roof, you're not saving anything. So it starts to be profitable with a comprehensive insulation. So we need experts to do this, and we also need to make sure that there is a financial decision made. Who will decide? At the moment, energy prices are so high that it's easier, but these are long-term projects. Will it be worth doing it next year? So we see that there is an issue around making that decision to start those projects. And that's one of the recommendations of the ZEN 2050 report. We're working on this. The question is, when it comes to funding, the only solution is to create an obligation for house owners, because if they're obliged to do it, they'll have to pay for it. So when you have to do something, you pay for it. Some might consider this as a environmental punishment. Some might think that low-income owners might not be able to do it. And I want to seize this opportunity to be here talking about social justice to help you change your perspective when it comes to obligations. I'll use the example of child labor. In the past, half children would die before the age of 10 when there was child labor. And in 1840, Victor Hugo at the National Assembly managed that children under 8 would not be able to work anymore. Then it took another 40 years to get free and obligatory school and preventing children under the age of 12 from working. One could think this is a great progress for the society, but it made people poorer. The poorest half of the population became less rich because they had to feed those children. They couldn't make them work anymore. They had to buy shoes for them. So by making school compulsory, this led to a significant loss in wealth for the parents. And thanks to Jules Ferry, we realized that the collective benefit was worth the individual effort of those who can afford it. And as for those who will help them, that is what we call the scholarship system. The point was to make sure, of course, everybody benefited from this because school was free for everybody. However, the scholarships helped those who were more in need to get this incentive for those who needed it. So I think this is very telling on how a collective benefit, when properly explained, can be accepted by low-income people if they are supported. So making sure that the population can accept this significant financial effort. And I think this applies to construction renovation. At the moment, the subsidies are not enough. 2 billion for certificates and 2 billion for renovation, which is not based on resources. And this usually goes in the pocket of some richer people who will implement the system. So this is one of the reasons why this project is not as efficient as we would like it to be. Yes, and actually, we recently heard that 75% of houses renovated as part of this system did not lead to any performance or additional performance. It's not that the construction works are not well done, but they're only partly. If you just change the windows, it's not going to be enough. If you don't change the boiler, if you don't do the whole renovation at once, it won't work. I was part of the expert group for the Citizen Covenant for the Climate, which proposed to make renovation compulsory. And this was a decision made by a sample of society. And they realized their first request was to do everything at once, because else we hear different stuff. So we want a comprehensive renovation, because if not, it's not doable. So they really wanted to have a one-off, unique project. And we happen to have 25 years to do this renovation. So if we do it step by step, it's a big project. If we don't, that's only 20 million project. So this global comprehensive renovation, if made compulsory at some point, not immediately of course, but if it's done in a rational manner, then it can have significant impact when it comes to energy performance. And we have enough experience now to know that we can make those savings. We can have an energy audit to assess which level of energy gain can be reached in certain projects. So this is insurable now, which is very important, because the house owners want to make sure that they will get the results of those projects. So making this compulsory seems like the best solution. Of course, we need to support more humble households, but there are some low-income owners, but that's not the majority of owners. So there are some owners. Of course, you shouldn't ask an 80-year-old woman to renovate their house, but once that person leaves the house or the apartment, you can ask the inheritant to renovate that before using or renting the house again. So might as well do this at the same time. So we can have systems that help with this. We have the COVID savings, for example, how to use that money to invest in those large carbon neutrality projects. Yes, Grégoire? Yes, about energy thermal renovation, I'd like to tell you about a pilot tool that has been developed or supported by the European Investment Bank. We'll talk about the industries later where we invest, but it's quite a telling example of what Europe could do to support local initiatives, actually regional initiatives. That's what we call the third funding societies. There's been several regions used as a pilot: Picardie, Nouvelle-Aquitaine now, Hauts-de-France. What's the idea? Based on seeing that for a household, usually when you buy a house, you get the highest level of debt you can get. But then when you talk to your banker 6 months or a year later in order to renovate the house, getting a new credit is very difficult. However, although there are some subsidies that are available, but they are not very easily to understand. The objective of this system is to have a single one-stop shop, and get advice on technical choices, renovating, insulation, changing the windows, information about the subsidies available, and a solution to fund the project. And what is very specific about this solution is that it includes inside your debt level, it includes the future savings on your electricity bill. So, in a way, your credit score goes up thanks to the fact that they're including those savings. And the objective of this system is to offer a credit based on that level of savings, and what you will end up paying, the remainder that you will have to pay, will be as low as possible, at almost zero if possible. So we've had several pilot projects in different regions in France, and when I was with Amélie de Montchalin, the State Secretary for European Affairs, we went to the Échy region in the north of France. It's a mining region with a very low income average. That's what we call les corons, this region, which is protected. You cannot have outside insulation. It has to be done inside, which is slightly more costly. And we got a chance to visit households who would use coal heating, which is the worst option. Not only they were cold, but this is really like energy misery. We also got to visit houses that were renovated thanks to this Maison et Cité organization, and we could see clearly that the houses were in a better state, so it gave a better value to the renovated house, and the money that the owner had to pay was very low. And when we heard this person we met, an elderly person, they told us that it's the very first time that Europe was helping them. And that shows how Europe can bring local solutions, including solutions that can support this energy transformation, which we all want, especially for more humble households to renovate their house.
Thank you very much. I've been listening to you for a while, and I think it would be interesting to have this transition as soon as possible, because it will last a few years before it's really operational. So we are talking about ESF was bringing 5 billion, and now we don't have it anymore. So I think it's time to put money on the table. But it's been a few years, and we've heard so many times that there's not enough money that can be invested in this. And I'm just wondering, like, as a citizen, you're always lost in front of that speech. You know, you're like, well, we need to invest, but we don't have the money to invest. We don't want to increase our spending, but at the same time, we don't want to increase taxes. And I mean, it's always complicated. I think you've said that we needed 40 years to prevent children between 8 and 12 to start working, and now you're telling, and it took us 40 years to change that, and we only have 25 years to make that change. And how can we change that? Change that society that is not ready to drive at 80 instead of 90 kilometers per hour on national roads? How are we changing that society? How do we get there? Obviously, we need a common story. And we are trying to contribute to that here at Convergence. But this is really important, you know, teaching and those measures and explain them, even some that looks like constraints. This is really important to understand them. But without that, we can't get anywhere. Is there co-owners in here? Maybe there are a few people there. Have you tried to get them, the rest of the co-owners, to save energy? It's extremely complicated, because if one of them doesn't want, then it's impossible. So it's really complicated. So if there is no mandate from the state obligating us to do it, it won't happen. In individual households, it will happen if it can be financed. And people, I don't know, an old lady that is on her own, or old anybody that has been there in their house for a long time, how can they make that change? So it will happen maybe if we impose it when the house is sold. Maybe that could be an option. So it's all those decision making that is going to be important, and to be able to facilitate that decision making, we need to explain things and tell the government, the financial system, so on, agree that there is a moment that the decision needs to be made. I don't know, for instance, when you are selling the house because things are happening, that's when the all the work is done in the house. So it's or if I don't know, people are retired, maybe we can have financing systems so they only pay interest and they don't have to pay the capital. So when you're selling your house, that's when the capital gets paid back. But so yes, it's putting money, it's making the actual house more expensive, but less expensive at the same time, because all the work for energy saving has been made, so it won't cost you as much in terms of energy. So there is a balance here. And suddenly, the value of housing reflect how well insulated the house is. And if this is something that is common, then people will know, and this will be fine. So it's a way to make things really tangible. So there are some mechanisms that can be implemented and that can be applied to individual cases. I like your example, but it's just extremely complicated. If you are a co-owner, it's really complicated. You can't go and access Europe funds. I know it's complicated, too complicated. Bank need to be able to lend to co-owners in the buildings and so on. And that's just a normal loan from the bank. And this is something simple. It doesn't have to be something exceptional and complicated. It needs to be in the norm. It needs to be normal, what you do on a daily basis. And you buy a house and you just renovate and make it better, energetically speaking. And we need to help the poorest household to do so. They need to have be able to finance it, and needs to be helped to do so. And that's exactly what the ANA has been doing, ANA. I saw you react on this co-housing thing, co-owners. Yes, I know, I agree, it's not simple, but you did something about it, and we didn't do a lot. Yes, because of this decision-making, and you've mentioned it, and I agree it's complicated. On this question of the political will, I've got the feeling we could have done it for 20 years. Why haven't we done it? Well, I think it's quite a lot of young people in here. Have you talked with your parents or your grandparents about green transition, and have you tried? Did you get a positive response and say, oh yeah, we'll try and give you a planet where you can live on for in the next 30 years? I work on ecology for 10 years, and my parents are still buying bottled water. So, yeah, exactly. The above 50 years old are the ones that are voting the most, and they are deciding of the future. And so the people we need to talk to are them, but also people that are listening, because we can see that some things are happening at European level. And by 2035, we won't be able to buy new petrol cars. And some housing will have to be renovating before being sold or rented. Not sold, just rented. So there are some things that are happening, and that's what we need to base ourselves on, so we can build from there. There's also some material indicators that we can look at. For instance, we've looked at the SNBC or the DEM that is giving a lot of information, and we can follow what they're doing. But we need to go and see the leaders, because the leaders, it's not that simple, because they, people are elected because they have a certain program. They've promised some things to their citizens, and very often it's liberal that are in power in Europe, and they think that this is not something we should look into now. And everything that is this economic financial system is a human belief, and it's something that we can change, we can move, and so we don't need to be extreme and make it disappear, but we can play with the rules. There was a decision that was made 2 years ago, is to cancel all the debts of states that were at the European Bank, and this is something that wouldn't hurt anybody. The central bank can just create money the way they want. They've created money during COVID. They've just given billions of dollars and euros, and also in other countries like in China and other places. This has happened. It's why don't we do it? It's a question of belief. I think Grégoire disagree with that, but it's not the topic of today, so I'm not going to go into this. I mean, this money needs to come from somewhere. So if it's not coming from the debt, the state debt, where is it coming from? So that's one of the possibilities that European Bank of Investment is suggesting. It suggests debts, but sustainable debts. Just cut out on the BCE on the debt is irrational. If the European says we don't pay you back, then is extremely complicated. Argentina did it, but to buy money back afterwards is extremely complicated and costs a lot of money. The day we say we're not paying you back, it would be really hard to finance your further debt. And we are very happy to have a really high, good level, good mark in terms of getting money from the financial market. And so just saying that basically just put money in it, it's really complicated, because it's just I'm not saying I'm saying it's a possibility, and I'm saying that the European Bank has that power. It would be just inside, because we can technically do it. It would have no impact on anybody. I know that every bank has their belief. Some people don't even know how money is created, but really, it won't have any impact on anybody. But I'm not saying that that is the only solution. What I'm saying is that transition needs to be financed one way or another. I'm not an expert in finance and money creation and so on. But personally, I find it really crazy to think that we don't want to pay back the debt we have towards the earth and nature. Everything we've done to ecosystems and everything. We don't want to pay that debt back, because we don't want to. We can't do that because we're not paying financial systems. I mean, for someone that doesn't know the financial system, that seems a bit crazy, doesn't it? This is something really hard to understand. And when we're asking them to put 20,000 euros into changing insulation in their housing, this is something that is really complicated, and they say, well, it's really, really hard because we need to finance it personally again when we are now spending money for a lot of other things, and spendings we make at European level, at state level, that we don't necessarily understand. So don't you think that the social contract needs to be rethought, so we can explain again where is the money coming from, and that people say, oh, we're spending a lot of money for ecological transition, but don't you think that people need to understand that better? So we can't redo the past, but it's not happening today. I disagree with you, but why aren't we having less emissions then? Because we need to do more. But financially, there's a lot of money on the table to finance transitional energetic transition. Sorry. We seem to have forgotten, but there are $750,000 million that have been invested for the ecological transition. Out of 100 billion euros in France, they're invested. There's 1/3 of that money that is going into ecological transition. The second third is on investment, and the third is on social help. Um, Digital transformation is something important, and ecology are two really important points we need to invest on. There are different roadmaps that have been put in place, and it's a lot of money. It's a huge amount of money. We're talking about, it's huge. So, and we have promised as the European Investment Bank to invest 1 billion euros into that. So there is a real wish to transform things, to change things. In France, there are stakeholders that are investing. It takes time because we're changing infrastructures. But we can't change everything in the blink of an eye. It just takes time. It's the decision. It's the decision that we are making now that will change how we provide energy in the future. So there are political choices that are happening now, and public financing that are made now and that will change the future. But what is done right now in France is ambitious and is towards change. We can't say there is no investment. It's not true. It's just there are investments. It's just that it will take time to be implemented. We have invested in renewable energies, for instance, but for instance, on hydrogen at the moment, this is not something it's not implemented yet. We invested in it, but it's not implemented, and it takes time. You can't do it within a year. That's impossible. So we have, on one side, this short time pressure because climate is changing fast. And then on the other side, we have investment that take time, and it won't happen between 5 or 10 years from now. We won't see what the money that's been invested will come to until 5 or 10 years. So it's structural choices that we are making now, and we need to start them now. So you're telling me that the resources are not sufficient. You are telling me that. But if the citizen is thinking that, and you say, okay, we've invested in that, but we also invest money in fossil fuels or in airlines and things like that. After the COVID, we've invested in them. So there are, and we are not investing enough in agriculture transition and so on. And so the citizen might be thinking that's not enough. I would like to react to that because I feel I am a citizen, and I think it's easy to just blame politicians and say they've not invested enough. A lot of people do that, but politicians are listening to us, and they look at us as voters will elect them again, and whether they will be ejected if they don't make the decisions the voters want. So it means that the decision you make when you go and vote is important, because for that to be understood by the citizens, by the voters, we need to explain, we need to teach and explain for people to understand whether is it mandatory, for instance, for school food courts to be vegetarians once a week or things like that. These are decisions where we need to include the citizens. We need to include everybody so that they understand what's happening, because the government is putting some aids in place to for instance, avoid fuel cars to be sold after 2035 and so on. But maybe there are other things that can be done. I don't know. Don't live so far from your work, and so that you have 2 cars to go to work and things like that. There are solutions that are possible, and there is financial help from the state to do so. And there's another topic I wanted to talk about is the carbon tax. If we are, there is also that question of if we're saving on one hand, then we're spending it on something else, and we have a lifestyle that is making us spend more carbon. So there is this question of balance that we need to find. So there's a point where we need just to teach, to explain to people what's happening. And we've not done that. And that's why the Gilets jaunes happened. At some point, the oil was really cheap, and so we didn't have to explain anything. And then suddenly the oil went up, and everybody reacted because we hadn't explained anything. I think for ecological transition to happen, everybody needs to make an effort. Businesses need to invest. They need to change the way they work with their employees, and so on. This car change is making change. I don't know. There is a factory in Reims where Renault has chosen to work and not dismiss anybody because they want to work on transition, ecological transition. So there are possibilities. There are things that can be made. But the decision that we make, when we decided that school was mandatory and free for all, it was not so easily accepted by the population. We explained. So when we take decision, we just have to explain and tell people why we're doing that, and say, yes, we'll make that effort. We will help people that cannot do it on their own, but everybody needs to make an effort, and we'll do it with you, alongside you, but we will do it. And I think Convergence is a very good place to create that understanding of ecological transition. What do you think on that? I very much agree with what has been said. Cyril Dumont says it regularly, and he makes good stories with that. But let's not forget that we need to be coherent. Because it's not that obvious because we don't all have the same means, but and the government has either give money to the ones that need it most, or lower of 30 cents the price of fuel to fuel your car. And I think that's the decision they've made, because a lot of people think this is something important, but a lot of people here know that maybe that's not the best decision. So who do we need to convince? People that vote. Have you ever been to an Assemblée Générale? In parties, there are less than 10 people that are under 60, and they are the ones that are making all the decisions. It's us, the young people, that need to go and see and help them to change. So it's really important. Why do we need to be coherent as well? Because it's important to have a European project and having Europe coordinating everything. We are in a liberal system that doesn't like to go into debt, but that's why Europe is trying to counterbalance this system. But also, we can say that all ecological spendings shouldn't be within the 3% limit. This is this golden rule, European golden rule. And say, when there's crisis, we can not respect it. Well, that happened during the subprime crisis. That happened again with COVID. Why couldn't it be something possible for climate change? It's something that will come through at some point. They don't have a choice. But there are still some people that are not willing to do that. Also, this question of coherence is having a carbon tax at the borders. Okay, EU is the further in this ecological transition. It's awful to think that, because we're not as far as we should be. But if we let all the other countries that don't have that environmental standards that are just selling their products on our continent, then it's pointless. So these are things that needs to be taken into account. This is something important. That's why we need to have a story as a society, so that the decision making can be made in knowledge. So we are all co-owners of the earth, and some people have more impact and some have less. And we need to repeat it everywhere, in schools, in universities, and so on. 2 or 3 years ago, I was in uni. Even people that are not convinced accept to say, even if they don't really want to make the change, they agree and say, yes, there are some changes that are needed. But if you go to people that are 50, 60, 70 years old and have worked all their life in one mindset, I can take an example. It's harder to get them to change. Let's take an example of engineers that have worked all their life. They say, I'm amongst the most educated people in France. If there's an ecological issue, I would have noticed it. I know my dad did polytechnics, and this is exactly what he says. And he says, as long as it's not mandatory, I'm not doing it. And I think that's where we need to change things. About this common story, this common vision, what can we do so that everybody accepts that transition? You've pronounced the word I wanted, acceptability. People need to accept things. And there is a specific question in France, is wind turbines. It's something that we can see in other countries that are much more open to this kind of renewable energy. Across Europe, I'm speaking. And in France, it's almost impossible to have an inshore wind turbines, because everybody wants renewable energy, but they don't want a wind turbine next to their home. So we innovated and we've put offshore wind turbines, and now you've got all the fishermen that are not happy. We did one in Courseulles in Normandy, and tomorrow there is one that will be happening at l'Île de Groix or Belle-Île. It's next to my home. I'm not going to go and because I think we need it, but it's going to be complicated. So now we've got floating offshore wind turbines. There is one that will happen in Lyon, next to Port-la-Nouvelle, where we go further in the sea, so that we use new technologies. That's why innovation is important in research, so that we can find solutions. And so we are further in the sea, so that there's no disturbance around, so we can have renewable energy, which is really important in the future. So, it's always that circle, whether it's positive or negative. Nowadays, people want to move to green energy, but are not ready to have it next to their home. When we're talking about acceptability, we understand that might be complicated, because there are incoherences in the speech we hear. We hear that we should stop sending emails, stupid emails, or have Wi-Fi on at night, but people are using private jets all the time, and we find that it's complicated as a simple citizen to accept that, and that's why some citizens are defying public policies and public decisions, because and also we consider that certain companies do greenwashing, and I think that's fair enough to say they're doing that. We've got more and more flights, more and more planes in the sky, but we will plant new trees, we are fine, we are a good company. So then when you ask people to buy an electric car, it's really complicated, it's hard on that kind of topics. When we were talking about 36 billion invested in ecological transition in France, and that's a lot less than what big companies, French companies, are giving to their stakeholders. So, we have the feeling that we are not investing enough money when we could find it. So how do we go further and create that coherence and have a real plan that will gather to everybody, the public sector and the private sector? How do we do that? I'm talking, technical, financially, but also culturally and in terms of attracting people into that. Yes, that's a common effort that needs to be made. And about the compensation, it's a way to. You can't tax fuel on international flights. That's how it is, and so that's compensating your flights is something important. How many people do that? I don't know. Okay, one person raised their hand. Okay, it's still minimal, but there is a moment where you need to finance it in a way or another one. A decarbonized economy is different. Fuel kerosene for airplanes in a decarbonized economy will be very pricey, and we are changing the prices, and this is something that we need to explain. Some things are going to be more pricey and others will be less. And I don't know, meat is going to be really expensive, a lot more than fruit and veg, for instance. And we need to explain that we need to change our perspective, change the way we look at things. And then there's something else. I think it's important for grandparents and grandchildren to work together. They do everything they do to try and get tax-free donations to their grandchildren. I hope you're part of them, but they're trying to look into that. Why is it limited to money? And why don't they say, why don't you renovate their house? Or why don't you vote for an obligation where you lived with energy that was cheap, but there's an effort that needs to be made for future generation. But they can understand, but we need to explain for a long time because they don't understand as quickly as young people. But still, they can understand. Very often, homeowners are older than people that rent their home. So there is a transfer from older people to younger people that needs to happen. And so once you've explained how coherent all of this is, then people can understand that, yes, it is acceptable because it's actually logical. And people understand that, yes, okay, it is a good thing to do that. Reaction? Can you react, Grégoire, on this need of financing and try to put all this together? I think we need to organize the entire society. If tomorrow we want to renovate the entire energy park in France, we don't have enough specialized workers, so we need to train them first. Same for agriculture. We need to help them to move towards organic farming. And this is something that needs to be organized. We need to train people, finance those training. We need to change the way we teach because the way it's taught in schools at the moment is not current, is not in line with what's needed. And we are talking about sectors that are low-income ones. We said before that we need to be careful with the poor side of the population. And you need to know that half of households don't pay for renovation in their home. Some people do, but half of them do not. And this is something we need to think about, because it will be to be done over 25 years, not just 1 year, So we are, and not just think short term and say, oh, we are elected now, so we are trying to follow what the citizen wants over the next 1 or 2 years. But that's not how we need to think. We need to think a lot further, because that's something that we have to keep in mind for a long time, for a few years. And we need to gather everybody together and try to have a common story, a common vision, and training is very important in that. And also finance people that might have to be unemployed for a while until they get trained. I don't know, if we talk about cars, for instance, electric cars are a lot, don't need to be maintained as much as fuel ones. And that means that some people will have to change because there won't be as much work in this. We also have an investment bank in France that is quite limited now. It's 10 times smaller than the German one, for instance. So there is another possibility here, not only by giving it more money, but also giving it a bigger scope, because at the moment it's quite limited. But that's another levers.
Grégoire, about the Public Investment Bank, I don't really have the same analysis, so that's another disagreement between us. But talking about obligations and imposing things, in Europe we can be proud of something, although the word sounds a bit complicated. It's the word taxonomy. What is the foundation here? We've always valued companies based on their financial value. And for those who work in investment, M&A, acquisition, we value companies based on their financial ratio. It's always been like this for years. And we're regularly adding extra financial criteria, meaning that we value the value of a company not only based on their financials, but also on all its values that are so-called extra financial values, supporting sustainability within the company. So the mission of the company, but also the way the company shares its profits, how decisions are made, how they analyze and possibly compensate their impact on the environment. And we are implementing standards, and we can be proud that Europe is at the forefront of these changes. And we must have the same standards in France, Poland, or Romania. We're making progress. There's no miracle. You have to start from scratch. I won't talk about Orpea, but there are other institutions who do a good job. It's even harder when you pretend you're good and people realize you're not. Yes, because there's a lot of criticism around those ESG standards or measurements. There will be certifications, there will be third parties approving the certifications. We're not going to change the society within a year, but we're progressively moving ahead, and Europe is at the forefront. And it's very interesting. If within 5 or 10 years we see that the most resilient companies are the ones that had the highest impact or ESG values, this will be a demonstration that the value of a company cannot only be valued on its financials, but also on what we call externalities of the company. For example, its social, environmental integration within society. I'm sure Mr. Milton Friedman would not agree, but let's move on. I have a question over here. That's the first person I saw. I'm trying to see if anybody else wants to ask a question. Yes, Bertrand Séné, economist and environmentalist. My first question was around funding thermal renovation in buildings. You talked about credits, And I have a question in mind. When we think about thermal renovation, that's good. It's going to reduce energy consumption in volumes. But what about a possible increase in energy or electricity prices? What would happen in that case? At first, we lended money to people renovating based on a price that was planned. What if things don't go well? What happens? Are these people unable to pay back? Is that planned for it? Etc. And actually, about this, I'm thinking that a credit for this might not be the best idea. In the Paris region, public transportation is funded by taxes at 80%. Thank God, because should users pay the whole price of public transportation, they would probably not use it anymore. It's way too expensive. So we really should have a reflection about this, because if we want to renovate all buildings, shouldn't this be funded in a collective manner, either through taxes or by creating the currency that we need to do this? And that's the question. Should we not print money? Because the theory says we shouldn't, and within 100 years, our great-grandchildren will think, why didn't they do it when it was technically possible? And the planet will be devastated because we thought it's best to do credit than print money. For the first part of your question, if electricity prices go up and you've reduced your consumption by 80%, that's not such a problem. And that's one of the points of comprehensive renovation, which is to shelter people from price variations. Of course, it's still variable, but it remains less impactful than what it is today. As for the rest, when it comes to debt, what is needed is that the banks take part in those fundings. France is a country of owners. Almost 50% of people own their house. People value this, of course. Public transportation is an example when you don't have a car. And the council housing or public housing system is actually at the forefront of renovation. Those managers know how important it is. But I think that this environmental transition is so difficult already that we should try and minimize other changes that are required in culture. If we need to change France, saying, okay, we need to change French people's taste for ownership, and then we will transition, we'll never do it. So we need to find the solutions that don't require us to change people. We need to do this transition with measures that are understood, explained, but that are as limited as possible. We're working on renovation, so let's focus on renovation without changing French people's culture around habitat and ownership. Reminder, as I told you, the work that we did at the Rousseau Institute was to propose that 3/4 of thermal renovation be covered by the state. So how do you finance that? Printing money? And it's a nice gift because people will save money later on. So if you say, okay, let's give it to everybody, first of all, there will be a queue, and then there's a budget in France. You cannot do that. I won't talk about the French budget, but I'm not an economist. But creating money it has an impact. That's called inflation. Printing money is good, but then you need to manage the inflation that comes from it. Having the energy transition being paid by taxes, we need to see who's paying. Behind taxes, there's a taxpayer. When it comes to debt, It's almost the most manageable option, especially if you can reduce the interest rate in an inflation context. Part could be subsidized for the interest rate. I come from microfinance, and I think Convergence agreed with that and worked on this for 10 or 20 years. If we want to guarantee the sustainability of investment in order to avoid any deviation effect, I think that credit subsidized for the lowest income possibly, I think that would be the most relevant option.
C'est d'éviter ce biais qu'on a souvent dans les conférences et qui se font.
Often men speak too much in conferences, so let's try to find a woman now.
Bonjour. Déjà, merci.
Hello, thank you for being here. Thank you for this interesting panel. My name is Capucine Richemont. I'm a student in HEC, focusing on sustainable development. I have a question for Christian. You talked about the investments needed to reach carbon neutrality. Out of those 36 public fund billions, are you taking into account imported emissions, which account for 50% of our carbon footprint, and what investment would be needed to reduce those imported emissions? Thank you for your question. I slightly referred to border carbon tax. We are only responsible for our emissions, not for what's produced in China or the US. That's why I talked about the border carbon tax. I also included part of this in aid to development aid. The people with less money must also be able to transition. They will do it slower, but we need to help them, or else they won't transition. It's a global issue. This is why this is an excellent question. We shouldn't have only the French perspective in mind. We are responsible as Europeans to lead. That's why we need to include this border carbon tax. These countries need to develop, they need to export cheaper products, but they cannot be carbon products. And there's not much we can do other than making international trade more fair by favoring decarbonized products, even abroad, and help those countries develop. And development aid is very important. So-called developed countries committed to 100 billions per year. That's the famous green fund from the Paris Agreement, which was never financed. And this is crucial because if we don't, just like for low-income households in France or Europe, they won't be able to transition. And since this is a global issue, we're not in front of a solution here. So we can reduce our emissions directly, but we also need to manage other countries. And actually, earlier you talked about the European Investment Bank around development aid or international solidarity. Yes, part of our mission is to fund and to invest in the name of European Union outside of our borders. That's 10% of our activity. Outside of European Union, that's about 8 to 9 billion euros per year. And we have one clear objective, which is the energy transition. That's our number one priority, especially in Africa, which is the continent that emits less but suffers the most the consequences of this crisis. So that's a priority for us. 9 billion for the EU is quite low, but it's still something. And we're hoping to do more in the coming years in relation with bilateral partners, the French Development Organization and the AKEV, because they also have internal activities, but also external outside of the EU. Thank you. A question over here.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci.
Hello, everyone. I have different responsibilities. I'm part of the CSE meeting, but also as an elected representative. First question, what are the expected funds for digital companies, which I'm part of, and what budget arguments could I give to my CEO so he makes investments in reducing our CO2 emissions? Second question is a call for help, almost. How will municipalities fund everything they need to do to reduce their carbon footprint and help households, knowing that their financial means are decreasing regularly? Some elected representatives say we don't have a budget for this or that, but so how can I tell them there are budgets, go look for them here? Another comment or a different perspective now on clean cars. I don't think we can change the whole thermal car fleet and replace it by electric cars. I think this will be too much constraint. I'm sorry for the youngest here, but you won't all own an individual car. That's over. I'm hearing that the government has a very ambitious project for the environment, but when one reduces the list of proposals made by the Citizen Covenant, I must say I don't really believe it. I think we should focus more on energy sobriety measures. I'm sorry for the youngest here. I did fly often, but I don't think you'll be able to do it as much as I did. I'm sorry. Finally, when I hear that politics make significant commitment for the environment, when the voters are elderly people who don't care that much about the environment. Thank you. That's a lot of debate. Maybe we can start with the question on how to convince your CEO for an IT company. I think that your customers will ask for this and will include it in their criteria to decide to buy or not. At the moment, we have a working group on IT where those companies explain that they're changing their IT system in order to reduce their carbon impact. They include it in their carbon calculations, so their specificities will change, and suppliers will help them reduce emissions as well, which includes the emissions of the supplier as well. So I think that the movement is now on, and that should go through a purchasing logic. It can also be a business opportunity for the company. I help such or such company carpooling, or having a smart carpooling system, or a circular economy, or virtual market. There's business in there. And companies are very much into circular economy models, which replaces long transportation systems with virtual systems. Return rates of e-commerce, or return rate in e-commerce is about 50%. Once you create a model to reduce return rate to 20%, that's emissions reductions, and that's a strong marketing argument too. I'm looking for a woman. Before I give you the floor, I can answer this question. I happen to be an elected representative in a municipality. They needed somebody fresh who knows about the environment, so they chose me. And they also say that they don't have the budget. And when they call me, I can take the floor, which is rare. But the average age is around 55 or 60 years old. Anyway, possibilities. I talked about the state earlier. The state cannot go over the 3%. And most public administrations cannot be in debt. They need to have a balanced budget. But there should be an exception for any investment that directly relates to transition. That is energy renovation, changing their car fleet, although there are debates on cars. We use the energy RTE scenarios. We talk about sobriety, less than 15% individual cars, so it's not crazy sobriety, but it's definitely another level. Same for public transportation. And just to complement what you said, our idea, it might be a bit technical, is that the state pays 2 billion every year for all local governments without asking for huge documents. Because just to give you an example, in 21 we had a plan. We've created subsidies plans and nothing has started, and that started a year and a half ago. So giving 2 billion to regional governments, asking just for a report every year. Report what you did, and if it didn't work, I'll take the money back. But at least what's good is that the government is paying 2 billion out of the 36 billion, so that would give some leeway to regional authorities.
Donc, d'abord, merci, Nathalie.
Thank you, Nathalie Bernard. I'm an advisor in responsible procurement, a question that has nothing to do with my work. I'm wondering about the role of reducing differences in ways of life to accelerate the environmental transition. Are there potential tools to create this collective narrative while reducing lifestyles and perceptions on lifestyles? We talked about mobility. In certain regions, mobility has to go through an individual car, if not two. Housing, access to ownership is crucial in agricultural regions when in Paris owning is very rare. So opening up to potential instruments that could be created in order to reduce this, should you consider it's necessary.
Tout à fait un enjeu. Il y a quelques...
Yes, there are some collective narratives, the PTEF or the Rousseau Institute work. We talked about the Zen 2050 study, which starts by 9 portraits of households showing how to live after the transition. So yes, we reduce a footprint, fossil fuels consumption, but increasing other things. Changing a way of life does not mean reducing. And the company that business had was to whether we were going back to a more humble way of life. It's, of course, a publication that is still popular. That's the point, anyway. Another role of companies is around advertisement. Advertisement creates desires, describes ways of life, and on the EPE website, you'll find something called Environmental Transition and Representation of Lifestyles, which is a guide of stereotypes, saying, okay, when you do an advertisement, you could change the background, show certain situation in order to have people understanding that you can still live well after a transition. You can be happy. There are some pleasant situations. It might be a lifestyle change for some, but it's not a general punishment. And that was one of the debates. Having this little houses residence system did not make people happy. And the yellow vests were in that situation, somehow stuck between their thermal car and their little house. One could explain that living in an apartment near public transportation can be pleasant more than this residential life that was a made-up dream in France. So one could consider developing this model. About the role of advertisement, I recommend you check the climate fresco. There's also an advertisement fresco that aims at raising awareness amongst advertisement professionals to create advertisement that matches the current society and the future society. I'll give the floor now to the next question. That's a great transition. I'm actually a facilitator of different frescoes, the climate one, the new narratives one, the one on biodiversity, environmental renaissance, so many impressive frescoes. The climate one had 450,000 people trained within 3 years, available in several languages, and it's really interesting because we can create a bridge between different topics. We rarely do that in our culture. And actually, the name of the session is to fund the environmental transition. And I'm hearing you talk a lot about energy. That's good. It's part of the transition. But biodiversity, for example, is a topic that is just as important as energy or even the climate. In those large frescoes, there are 4 standard ones: climate, biodiversity, oceans, and environmental renaissance. Then there are other frescoes that are more humble, but just as interesting. For example, the one on, I didn't know the one about advertisement, but the one on narratives is very important. I think we'll have the fresco on biodiversity tomorrow. We also have a low-tech fresco. So those frescoes are a tool for collective intelligence that helps build bridges. And actually, as part of your roundtable, I'd ask you not to forget biodiversity, because without biodiversity, we won't even talk about anything. Well, that's actually the second part of my answer, which is urban planning, which causes huge problems to biodiversity and land management. That's why we insist on how urgent it is to get those funds, because there are many other problems. We have only calculated what was required to reach carbon neutrality. That's the first issue, the main one, because this issue will take decades or even centuries to be resolved. But then there will be biodiversity, cleaning oceans. We should be able to do everything at once. But it's the same for adaptation. Many people realized it this summer, realized that there was global warming. And some realized that we might need to improve insulation to avoid feeling too hot in the summer as well. And we need to plan for all the cities by the coast to be ready to be moved out. So there are many other issues, you're absolutely right, but we need to target issues. And in order for us to do our study for several months, we had to target this issue. And the rest is just as important, and we shouldn't forget it. That's why it's so important that it should already be done, should have been done a long time ago, to move on to the next issue. Grégoire, about biodiversity, it's harder to measure than carbon. No, but we've decided to allocate part of our funds, 15% out of the climate activities focus on biodiversity, especially around lands, not only in the EU, but outside. We also talked about seawalls in Venice, for example, and we might have to do this again for other cities. So we're very much aware of this. As for the ocean, we talked about our partners, the Reconstruction and Development Bank. We have a project to fund 4 billion euros on projects that aim at getting plastic out of the oceans. So Europe is acting, trying to provide funds to meet those priorities. There's many of them. We have the energy topic, which forces us to accelerate, but the topics are biodiversity, environment, global warming, and that's our number one priority when we decide to make investments with companies, but also local governments. And actually, I wanted to bounce back on that. We can add the attractiveness of the company for employees as a criteria. If you don't transform your company, you might have less interest or might be less attractive to future employees. As for local governments, you talked about 2 billions. The Prime Minister just announced 1.5 billions recently, although we haven't completely understood how this Green Fund will be implemented, and I'm waiting for the Congress next week to get more information about this. But there are solutions, and we can be proud. In France, we talked about the Public Investment Bank, which is part of the Caisse des Dépôts, which also includes the Territory Bank. We funded these amounts to several billions of euros. So there is European support to the territory banks so that they can lend to smaller authorities. We have direct management or direct communication with the regions in France. However, for projects from the municipalities or departments, the Territory Bank is doing a great job and covering the whole territory to fund smaller size projects, whether it's biomass, transportation, all types of smaller scale projects that are part of this transition. Thank you very much. I'd like to hear more questions, but we're reaching the end of this session. We could have talked more about biodiversity. We talk about compensation, planting trees. Sometimes it raises questions. We could have talked about low tech, hydrogen, electric car. We couldn't cover everything within an hour and a half. But you can find this information on the UMatter website, which I facilitate every day with Corentin Clotilde. You can find all the resources about our speakers on their websites, the Rousseau Institute, EPE, and the Investment Bank. Thank you for being here. I hope you were interested by the conference, and you can still follow the debates on Convergence, who hosts the debate today. If you're available for further discussions in the hallway, I will be. Thank you.